Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait another minute or two for others to join. All right, Adrian, what do you think? Should we get started?
Let's go for it.
Okay,
We have it recording, so anyone can catch up at any time.
great. Well, good afternoon again, folks. My name's Marina Bowie. I serve as the Forest Economy and Timber for Transit Program Manager here at the Northern Border Regional Commission. I'm joined by Adrian Harrison, who is our Catalyst Program Manager, and together we'll be kind of walking you all through this budget workshop today. I also see that our colleagues Milena Tamer and Casey Haynes are on the call, as well as Christy Farnham and Elizabeth Nance, who represent Vermont. Thanks for joining. All right. So first of all, congratulations to you all. You have officially been invited to submit an application. We realize that those invitations to apply you might have received just recently. So already getting started on the application, it's a good jump start into budgets here today. So your invitation to apply, you will see in the Collab tab of the grants management system. It means that NBRC and our state partners valued your project and want to see more. So this is the first in a series of application workshops meant to support you all as you develop your application. Today's session, as you see, will focus on budget documentation within the application. And as Adrian mentioned at the start of this call, this will be recorded and the slides and recording will be made available on the NBRC website. We'll ask you all to keep your microphone muted until the end of the session, at which point we'll have plenty of time for questions. In the meantime, you're welcome to use the chat function to ask questions along the way. All right, so, All right, so today's session will cover 5 budget-related documents, narratives, tables, and forms in the application, including the SF424 CBW, which is the detailed budget, the GMS budget categories table, the budget narrative, the funding sources and commitments table, and the SF424 application for federal assistance. We'll review each budget-related item as well as common errors. For the purposes of today's session, we won't go into a lot of detail around how to create your application, but we do want to highlight those resources that are available to you. So our quote, creating and submitting an application guidance document was actually updated this morning with some clarifications and additional details we felt were necessary based on the spring round. We also have recorded office hours where we helped folks through the process and answered questions. So you can view those on the website, and those are linked here as well. As with pre-applications, the program user manuals will be an important resource as you develop your application. The application portion of the user manual walks you through each section of the application with guidance on what we're looking for each. And not listed here, but your invitation to apply letter that was issued by NBRC includes feedback from the Commission and our state partners. And for those that were invited to apply from the Forest Economy Program, includes some feedback from our advisory board as well. And all of that feedback is around kind of where you can strengthen your proposal for the application. If you have not yet located your invitation to apply letter, you'll find it in the collab tab of your GMS application, and it should have been emailed to you as well. All right, I'll shift our focus to budgets. It's important to point out that at the application stage, you're not starting from scratch. Much of the information you submitted at pre-application will carry forward. In terms of budget items, the budget categories, budget periods table, and the budget narrative and funding sources and commitments table will all be pre-populated with what you submitted at time of pre-application. So know that that information is there, but it's also adjustable by you based on the feedback you receive, based on more accurate quotes and projections for the costs associated with your project. The newer items at application include the SF424 CBW, the detailed budget, which we'll get into today, the SF424 application for federal assistance, and the funding sources and commitments table, while it was part of the pre-application, will now be a required field for you to submit your application. And once again, pro tip, please look at the feedback in the letter to apply. We took a lot of time to provide detailed and specific feedback for each of our applicants. And some of that included some budget feedback. So in your invitation to apply, you might have received some budget feedback. These include the bullet points listed here. We'll walk kind of through each of these pieces of feedback sporadically throughout the presentation today, but as a quick overview, if your budget narrative did not include sufficient detail, or if you did not provide a list of matching fund resources, you will see that reflected in the feedback. If based on our review, we determined the project was not eligible for a higher maximum award, or for Catalyst specifically, if the project didn't meet the criteria for an infrastructure level award, you'll see the flag that the request exceeded the maximum award and qualifies as non-infrastructure. If your project appears to qualify as infrastructure, but there were no construction costs listed, you'll also see that flagged, and you'll need to provide construction costs within the budget at time of application. If your project included other federal funds, we have flagged that our federal funds limitation, which is that no more than 80% of the total project can be covered by federal funding, including the NBRC award. If we found that your match was incorrect or needs additional review, we flag that as well. As you're developing your application, we recommend completing the SF424 CBW detailed budget first. This is a required form, and once you have finalized the 424 CBW, it should be really simple to go into the grants management system and update all of your other budget information, the budget narrative, budget categories table, and funding commitments table, to ensure that all of those pieces are in alignment. And we'll be looking for that in our review. So with that, I will pass it over to Adrienne to do a deep dive into the CBW form.
Great, thanks, Marina. Okay, so the 424 CBW, or we sort of abbreviate and called the detailed budget. This, as Marina said, is available in the supporting documents checklist. This is something you haven't seen as part of the pre-application process yet. This is new information for you to create and new information for us to review at NBRC. So this document, you can access it in the Forms and Files tab of the Grants Management System of your application. You'll want to navigate to the screen you see here highlighted, and at the bottom of the supporting documents checklist is the SF424CBW, and you'll click on the template link. There's a blue text that says view, and you can click on that link and it will download the 424 CBW form for you. You'll want to save that to your computer, work on it, and when it's complete, then you'll actually upload that document back to the supporting documents checklist. You'll have a slightly different screen than you see here, but there is basically an arrow that you'll click on in the grantee section for the SF424CBW and upload your version of that document there. It's important to not upload this document in the application files section or any other section of the forms and files tab. This is something that we will validate. It's a required document for all applications. So when you go to submit your application, you'll want to make sure that SF424CBW has been uploaded. Okay, you can also find a copy of that, by the way, on the NBRC resources website, but we recommend going through the grants management system. All right, so the 424 CBW, when you look at it, if you're new to the CBW budget document, it's quite detailed, and it really is a comprehensive sort of breakdown of the proposed project costs. And it allows NBRC and our partners to see how the funds will be allocated and spent. So we're really looking at how you're using the NBRC share of funds, the funds you're requesting from NBRC, as well as how you're planning to use your match dollars and other funding source dollars. And it's really an important piece of our process for evaluating and comparing project proposals. And so that's why we wanted to take some extra time to really walk through what this document is and some of the areas that we commonly see, that can trip grantees up when they're putting them together. So we'll walk through we'll walk through this sample that we have on our website. So if you're curious in looking at this in its entirety, it's available on our NBRC resources page. It's the sample SF424CBW. And we'll be walking through some of the items that are highlighted in that sample. First, I really encourage everyone, if this sounds maybe silly, but there's an area for you to complete your name and your address, the applicant name and address. That's really important to complete. It may not seem important, but we look at a lot of these, and we wouldn't want to accidentally be looking at the wrong one when we're reviewing yours. So we really look to have the applicant name completed. Next on this slide, I'll highlight the estimated costs column. This is the fourth column over, and that's the total for each of your cost categories. And this is really important to note that those costs those are something you enter. They're not the total of the allocations that you're putting in the column. So one thing that we've seen happen in the past is that the estimated cost column do not align with the sum of all of the allocation columns to the right. So the NBRC share, applicant match, those all total separately from the cost estimate that you enter. And so we'll we'll highlight this again, but one of the things you'll want to pay attention to is that the cost estimates align with the amount of resources you're putting towards that line item in that row. So you'll just again need to make sure the amounts in columns G through O add up to those estimated costs. And in those columns G through O, that's where you allocate the share for each of the line item costs. One thing important to note on this form is that it says HUD share. Just in your head, replace HUD with NBRC. We borrow this beautiful form from our friends at HUD. And when you see the word HUD, that really does mean NBRC. And so this is where you're going to allocate the requested funds from NBRC to the different line item costs. So you can, go through the budget and allocate where you're dedicating NBRC funds. Similarly, for the other columns, you'll want to go through and allocate your match and any additional cost share across the line items. And the sum of all those contributions should again be equal to the estimated costs for each line item. I will also highlight that the SF424 CBW form has a few tabs associated with it in its Excel format. And one of those tabs is an instructions tab. In the next few slides, we're going to go over some of the cost categories. If you're not clear as to the type of costs that should be included in each of the categories, there's, I believe, 10 categories. You can refer to that instructions tab, and it provides some additional guidance on the types of costs that should go into each category. Bob, I see you have your hand up. Do you have a question about the slides so far?
Yes, I had
Sure.
a question about the types of costs that go into the category of category one.
Okay.
We're planning on constructing the work with our forces. So the whole project is a construction project. Um, we would not, and I see later on in the form that it has where you put your construction costs in, where category one is talking about, is that beyond construction costs? Because we're going to have our own laborers, and our own, at their own rates and so forth and so on, with their fringe benefits eventually. I wouldn't put them here, would I? I would put those in the other section on construction where it doesn't require that type of information.
Right. You can. So, we can get into details. If, for instance, you have, your own engineers, you can put the engineer personnel costs in, for instance, category 8E, which is engineering fees. Um, if you have costs that are related to administering the construction project, you could put those within category 8A. So we can definitely take a closer look at the types of costs that you're planning to include for construction. I would say that if for personnel, if it's overarching, if it's not directly related to the construction, you can put that here in the category 1, personnel.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I understand. We intend, we do our own engineering in-house, and we weren't going to charge any of our engineering time whatsoever to the project for reimbursement. The only thing we were going to do was build the work when we get to that point and invoice for the our share of the costs that are allowed for our construction work only.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't have probably nothing in one or 8A or B at all, because that would be all done by our engineering work and not charged to the job.
Okay, yeah, we can, if you want to send a specific, technical assistance request to our admin at nbrc.gov email address, I can walk through that in a little more detail than we can probably hear online. So again, anyone with questions can use our admin at nbrc.gov email address. Also, if you're using an LDD, that could be something that you ask for some specific review in terms of your draft application on.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay. So that's great. Thanks for bringing up your questions. Feel free to keep bringing them up and to also use the chat box if you have them. Okay. So let's see, back to our 424 CBW. And so, yeah, we're going to kind of continue the conversation about different categories. And there are some costs that most, if not all, of our applications will have. And so I wanted to highlight where those should go in the 424 budget. One of those costs, while it's not applicable to all of our applications, so if you're in the Forest Economy Program or the Timber for Transit Program, if you have an application in one of those programs, unless it was required in your invitation to apply, those applications, those grantees you're not required to use an LDD for grant administration. For those applying through the Catalyst program, unless you received an LDD waiver, an approved waiver at the pre-application stage, or unless you're a state agency, you will be required to use an LDD for grant administration. And the best place to put those costs are in category 6 in the consultant category. And one of the things we really ask is that you provide a description of each of the line items of costs that you're putting into the CBW form. So in this case, we really ask that you clearly mark the LDD costs within category 6. And those are 2% of the requested NBRC amount. So you'll want to, the estimated cost should equal that 2% of the NBRC requested amount. And then you can allocate that across either the NBRC share or another share. It's fully reimbursable by NBRC funds, so you're welcome to put the entire amount in the NBRC share column, or you're also welcome to split it across share sources. Next slide. So another cost that goes into category 6 is your NEPA cost. NEPA costs they apply to all of the NBRC projects. So if you're in Timber for Transit, Forest Economy, or Catalyst, NEPA applies to all of our projects. And again, that should go in category 6 under the consultant section. And we've tried to kind of rough out some guidance based on our experiences. There's definitely no, this isn't a definite range. This is just sort of approximated based on some of our experiences with the NEPA process and the NEPA costs. And so if you expect your project to fall into a categorical exclusion category of NEPA, and that would not require any consultations for historic resources or listed species, then you can budget $0, maybe $500, something minimal for the NEPA cost line. We really ask you to label that NEPA cost line, and even if you expected your budget to be $0, we encourage you to say in your description, NEPA costs expected to be $0. And that signals to us that it wasn't left out on mistake, that you've really thought about it and you feel that your project will go forward with a categorical exclusion and no consultations required. And we also have a NEPA website. So if some of the things I'm saying are not quite making sense, I'm sort of assuming that you've heard my spiel about NEPA in the past. But if you would like to review some of our information on our NEPA process and our environmental review requirements, we do have a web page dedicated to NEPA, and you can see it here. Moving along with some more estimates for cost estimates for our different NEPA categories. The second would be a categorical exclusion, plus, there may be some historic resources nearby. You may have a historic structure that you're impacting. There may be potential for impact to listed species. So the project may fit a categorical exclusion category, but also would require a consultation with one of our resource agencies. And so in addition to making sure you budget time for that process, there are some costs associated with developing the information packets and the potential requirements from those Section 106 agencies to complete their review. So we typically recommend budgeting $500 to $1,500 if you feel your project will fall into that category. And finally, the environmental assessment. As it says here, it's a much more robust review. There's more information gathering, potential wetland studies, or different requirements of that process. And so we recommend budgeting $5,000 to $10,000. Certainly, if your project is a complex project, costs could exceed that amount. And so, if you need additional guidance on how to best budget for NEPA, you can certainly reach out to NBRC and we'll do our best to help you plan for those costs. Okay, next slide. Okay, one of the flags that Marina mentioned was around no construction costs. Again, construction costs are a requirement to be eligible as an infrastructure project in the Catalyst program. And so if you received that feedback, it means that we're looking for construction costs in your budget. It's really helpful to us to see, to reviewers, to see direct connections between your project. So like the tasks and activities you're describing and all of your narrative of your application actually reflected in your budget. And so that's why, again, we ask for the descriptions of each line item so we can make those connections and see how the funds are supporting your application information. So for example, if you have a water storage project, we would expect to see some sort of construction line dedicated to the construction of the water storage tank, the site work that might be involved with that, and to see each of those lines represented in the budget for construction costs related to that work. Okay. So those were some of the highlights of our sample for the 424 CBW form. There's, like I said, about 10 categories. We're really, looking for descriptions of each of your line item costs. So when you're going back through your completed 424 CBW, look to see that all of the costs that you've identified provide a description of what those are going towards. Again, that all of those estimated costs are equal to the sum of the contributions from each of the share columns. A few of the common issues we see are also related to exceeding the amount that you're eligible for. As Marina highlighted, if you see that you've exceeded your maximum award size in your letter, your invitation to apply, that may mean that either you inadvertently went over a maximum award size, or that your project has been reclassified to a different award size after review. So if you have questions about that, um, feel free again to reach out and
Hey, Adrian, I think we're losing your sound. I was hoping it was just me, but it looks like others are chiming in too that we're losing you. Can others hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you, but I can't hear her.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Adrian or Marina, maybe she's having a bandwidth issue. If she shuts off her video, maybe the sound will come back.
Yeah, we'll see if that works. Now we're getting some rain here, so rain and storms can disrupt connection too. All right, Adrian. Well, I think you're about done with this slide if I'm correct. But essentially, reach out to admin@nbrc.gov if you have questions that you don't find answers to in our program materials or in that sample SF424 CBW. All right. As for this SF424 form, this one is relatively self-explanatory, and we also have a sample of this form as well. This is the application for federal assistance. And we'll review this form more completely in the third application workshop where we go over forms and files. However, we do want to point out one common budget-related issue we see in this form, which is that the federal amount in box 18A here should be the total of the NBRC share and any other federal funds that you are contributing to this project. So any other federal match. So again, NBRC share plus federal funds will be the total federal in your SF424 form. The other elements here, the applicant, state, local match will be that more self-explanatory, the totals in your funding sources and commitments table that are associated with those. All right, and again, the SF424 sample with instructions are available on our website and linked here. Moving on to our budget table. This is a familiar table for all of you. You completed it as part of your pre-application. And this table will be pre-populated from the pre-application stage, and you should have the ability to edit and adjust. It may likely need to be updated based on accurate cost estimates and feedback from NBRC. And please know that the categories listed in the budget periods table mirror exactly what is the categories in the SF424 CBW. So that's why we say complete that really detailed budget first, and then you can go in and say, these are my total personnel costs, construction costs, etc. And it should be much easier than to fill out or update your budget categories table. And then you'll just want to make sure that all of the totals and all of those individual line items match up with the CBW form. This budget table will also be used throughout the life of the project. So if you're awarded funding, this budget table stays with you. You want to make sure the values listed in the budget table in the GMS, again, match the values in the 424 CBW. Again, at the time of application, we understand you may have more detailed cost estimates, so make sure to be updating kind of across the board. And again, we recommend the CBW first, and then you can do a one and done update across the board. All right, a couple of final reminders. There's this 80% federal funding ceiling, which is based on the total project costs and includes the NBRC share. So be sure that the NBRC share plus any other federal funding for your project does not go above 80% of your total project costs. We're warning you kind of now and bringing this up now because the GMS will check this, but you won't see a flag until you hit submit on your application. So we've seen folks get to, 4:58 on the day they need to submit an application and find that this GMS error pops up saying you have gone beyond the 80% federal cap. So just be sure to check that. And as always, start your application early, which you all are already on top of since you're joining this workshop today. Same thing, an error could populate if you are not meeting the minimum required match for your project. So be checking that along the way. And then we're also flagging that ARPA funds are considered a federal source, but CDBG funds or loans are not considered a federal source. So we tend to get those questions, so flagging that here as well.
And Marina, this is Adrienne. I'll add that the congressional CDS funds, the congressional directed spending funding is also a federal source of funds.
Amazing, thank you. And we heard you loud and clear, at least I did.
Yes, sorry about that.
Awesome, no worries. All right. So moving on to the budget narrative. This section is also familiar for all of you as you submitted as part of the pre-application. It's used to describe and justify the costs listed in the budget periods table and should provide enough information for us to understand how NBRC funds will be spent. And all expenses over $5,000 must be listed with a description of the cost and an explanation of how the cost was estimated or determined. Here you can clarify which parts of your budget are estimates based on quotes or fixed price. You'll see this yellow icon at the top right. You are limited to 5,000 characters here, so just plan for that as you write out your budget narrative. And again, the budget narrative should be supportive of all of the other budget pieces in your application and should kind of further describe the project narrative and provide more detail. Oftentimes, as we're reading through applications, if something is not clear within the narrative in terms of how funds are spent, we start to look to the budget tables and the budget narrative. All right, so we're providing a couple of examples here. First is a construction example. So this is an example of a well-constructed budget narrative. This snapshot I know might be hard to read, but this is an example of a project who submitted their budget narrative and listed out each of the construction costs for the project. And it's organized by the category number in the SF 424 CBW. So that section 8 of the CBW or the detailed budget is the construction category. And you'll see this person listed out each line item from that section. And then where possible, they've even drawn references to the cost estimates and how they came to those numbers. So just an example of how a budget narrative can add that additional clarification related to the work to be completed within the project and kind of how you're coming to the requested amount. This particular example shows some NEPA costs estimated here. Please note that for this round, we've asked folks to list the NEPA and LDD costs both in category 6 of the detailed budget. So this will look a little bit different. All right, and here's another example of a budget narrative. This one is for a non-construction budget. The applicant broke out large cost categories, in this instance, staff salaries and fringe costs, to show how they came up with the overall personnel costs and how salaries are determined at their organization. Again, it's always helpful to draw specific connections to the line items in the detailed budget. Again, for the budget narrative, note that you are limited to 5,000 characters.
Okay, we'll give this another try. Hopefully my internet hangs in there. The final sort of piece to our budget documentation group is the funding sources and commitments table. And this is located sort of at the end of the budget tab screen. So within your application, you'll click the budget tab where you're finding the budget periods table and the budget narrative, and you'll scroll all the way to the bottom, and that's where the funding sources table is. A lot of you entered information in at the pre-application stage, and that will carry forward. However, if you received a note in your invitation to apply that says no funding sources listed, that means this table was not completed at the pre-application stage. So we're highlighting that because A, we really like this information. It's really important to us in the evaluation of your project. And B, it's required at the application stage. So especially if you did not enter anything in at the pre-application stage, you'll want to be sure to review and complete this table now with your application. So a complete table, this is an example of one that has been submitted in the past, and we'll walk through all of the different elements, but essentially you'll see a line for each source, the type of funding, the amount, the commitment, or the status or the date that you expect those resources to be available if they're not already committed, and the status. Next. So the purpose of this table is, again, to share the sources and the status of those funds that will be used to provide your match, so the minimum applicant match, as well as any other funding that's required to complete the project, which we call cost share. So we're really looking to see that all of the funding sources that are required to complete the project have been identified. So you should not include the NBRC amount here, but all of the other sources that are going towards the project should be included here. And this table will validate that the sources that you've listed match up with all of the additional sources you've listed in your budget periods or budget categories table. So if you received an error message related when you went to submit your application and it was related to the funding sources, that is the primary source of that error message. That the amount of funding that you've entered into the table does not match the amount of funds that are required to complete the project, the non-NBRC funds that are required to complete the project. So all match sources should be identified. And if you don't know a source of some of your funds, you should still include a line item that says unknown or to be determined, something along those lines. That way, it helps us identify the funds that are still really unknown, but also you will not receive an error message for missing some amount of funding that's required to complete the project. And a reminder that NBRC requires all match and cost share to be committed within 1 year of receiving the award. And it's not required, but it can really be helpful, really be impactful to see letters of support or letters of commitment from some of those entities that have committed cost share or match to your project. Thinking of maybe if you have any local business involvement with your project, if they're providing some sort of matching resources, that can be really impactful to have a letter from those entities that are supporting your project. So for each source, as we saw in the table, you'll want to add a line for each source of funding. And for each of those sources, you'll want to, provide a description of where those funds are coming from. Maybe it's a grant from another nonprofit. Maybe it's another federal agency that has a program that you received funding from. So you'll want to provide a unique description for each funding source. You'll also want to designate the type of funding it is. So some of the options are local, federal, non-federal, state, applicant. So you'll want to select the type of funding that is most representative of that funding source. And again, the Congressional Directed Spending and the American Rescue Plan Act, CDS and ARPA funds are considered federal funds, so those should be labeled federal. And CDBG and federal loans are not considered federal funds. CDBG is typically considered state, and federal loans can be other or other federal, not other federal, other. Then you'll also input the amount of funding dedicated from that source. The date of commitment, secured or pending, that column is really meant to tell us when you expect those funds to be available if they're not already committed. So if they are committed and, for instance, you received the award on July 1st, 2024, so you have the funds in hand, that's what you would enter. However, if it's something you've applied for and you're still waiting on a response, you could enter the date that you expect to hear back about those funds, or a general date that you expect to have those funds available. The status, that's where you can describe sort of where you are in the process of securing those funds. Secured is, generally you've received it, they're committed. Pending, you may have applied for those funds, or maybe if you're a city or a town, you need to have a vote to raise those funds from the community. And identified, that's something you've identified a source, but you haven't applied for it yet. We often see the status ongoing to describe something that you might be fundraising for. Maybe you have, an ongoing process to raise funds for this particular project. So those are the suggested statuses to use in that table. And then, of course, the total amount at the sort of bottom, or the funding sources will have a total amount of the funding sources that you've identified, and those again should match up with the budget period table. And I can take this one, Marina. I can't remember if it was supposed to be you or me. But this is, we have a document developed around a lot of these common error messages that you've heard us describe that you may run into. So if you get an error message, our suggestion is to go straight to this document because it's likely someone else has experienced that too. And we've put together some guidance on how to fix those specific messages that you're seeing here on our website and in that document.
All right. Finally, for the budget evaluation for all programs, budgets and costs, including contingency for construction projects, need to be clear and reasonable. We expect project costs and match to be clearly outlined and projects to include a detailed budget that aligns with the project description. The budget should show detailed costs and relevant cost estimates, and the project timeline should be feasible and support timely project completion. Applicants should identify sources of match in the budget and detailed budget narrative, and may provide or be asked to provide letters of commitment or support to confirm stated matching contributions. So kind of just summarizing all that we've gone over today. Leveraged funds, in addition to the required match, should also be described if applicable. And the budget narrative should be aligned with the project description, providing that brief justification for expenses over $5,000. And if you're requesting a higher maximum for an infrastructure project, describe how the requested funds will be allocated across infrastructure categories. As stated here, budgets are an important component for reviewers in evaluating the project and understanding the investment and how NBRC funds will be used. So it can really, again, help us to clarify, again, really how the NBRC is investing funds for the project. And for all programs, you'll refer to the NBRC scoring criteria number 2 at the end of the relevant program user manual. And that further kind of lists out how these budgets will be scored. All right. With that, I will welcome questions. You'll see this slide. We've listed all of the resources we've mentioned today that will be helpful for you as you develop your application. These workshops, of course, are program user manuals, the GMS application guidance and recorded office hours, the SF424 CBW sample and SF424 sample, the GMS errors resource that Adrian mentioned, the NBRC NEPA page, program FAQs. If your question is not answered in any of those good resources, please feel free to email us at admin@nbrc.gov. And Robert, I see that you have a question. I don't know if you're trying to speak, but you're muted.
I think you mentioned already, but the budget is allowed to be tweaked for from the pre-application budget that we had submitted. We're allowed to change those numbers slightly, whatever, for the final budget. One of the things you had mentioned was to put something in for NEPA that one might not have put in before. That's correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Any other questions? Yeah, Denise. I saw you came off mute anyway.
Sorry, that was an accident. I don't have any
That's
questions.
okay. All right. Robert, do you have another question?
Yeah, when we were looking at the budget table, there was a line, I believe under the 8. Was a line that said equipment. And the equipment that you're referring to on the table, would that be more so purchased equipment? The reason why I ask is because a lot of times in a construction project, there's equipment used on the job, heavy construction equipment, backhoes, front end loaders, dump trucks, and so forth. And they're normally on a federal project like a FEMA project. They just bill by the hours and the FEMA rates and so forth. So that line that you have that says equipment is not to be used to indicate normal, it was line 8J for construction equipment. It's
Yeah.
really for purchase of equipment. Is that correct?
Well, certainly, you can include the cost of rental equipment, which I think is what you were talking about in
Oh.
8J. In the other category, there's another category for equipment, which is category 4. That is for the acquisition of a piece of equipment. So if you're purchasing a
Okay.
piece of equipment, in the construction section, you can put the rental of construction equipment.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions while you have us here online? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone come off mute or raise a hand. We hope that we've provided you at least with the direction towards all of our resources that we have available. And definitely, if you do come up with a question along the way, feel free to let us know through the admin at nbrc.gov. But yeah, we'll also, I think, as it gets closer to the application due date, potentially have one more session that's sort of like a crash course if anyone's having issues with their application. But we'll put that announcement on our website. But stay tuned for that. It'll be much closer to the application due date. Great.
Thanks,
Well,
Adrian.
Thanks, Marina.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
everybody for
Thanks,
joining.
everyone.
We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.